Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you are up this week.
Yes, sir.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I am so excited to be bringing the book Teach Truth, The Struggle for Antiracist Education, which was written by Jesse Hagopian, to the table for us today. I mentioned this last week when I introed this, but this is our very first book of 2025. I feel like
That's correct.
That was your shot for an air horn.
Yeah.
There you go.
There's several air horns.
There you go. And, I think that given that this episode is going to be released just a couple of days, right, after the inauguration, it's right on time. It's right on time.
It is.
But so to really get into this properly and to introduce this book, it really is a survey and an analysis. But this concept of critical race theory and how uncritical race theorists, as Jesse has dubbed them, have launched this intense, widespread, wide-ranging attack on anti-racist education at all levels of education across the country. Mm-hmm. And these attacks have unfortunately had a significant and profound effect on so many aspects of education. It hasn't just been on the content of what teachers have been able to teach and this idea that they should be teaching accurate, important, necessary content to their students. It's also been in the form of assaults on and legislation banning books, which a lot of folks have heard about, and critical thinking and civic engagement and quote unquote divisive topics. And honestly, just the full spectrum of DEIJ initiatives and education and awareness and understanding. And, kind of reading this book and seeing how this has played out in so many places across the country was wild. I mean, I think I might have said this last week, but I feel like almost every state was mentioned, even Maryland. And that was so unfortunate and sad. I think one of the most compelling things he says in the introduction about this, which I think this will set up our conversation so we can get started, is this. Quote, astoundingly, almost half of all public school children across the country today are subjected to laws that forbid honest education about the history of racism. But the force of these laws is much more extensive than even this statistic suggests. The fear of retribution for teaching the truth has created a chilling effect so cold that an incredible 2 out of every 3 U.S. teachers report self-censoring discussions on race, gender identity, and sexuality in their classrooms. Right? Yeah. And so that's where we are. And I really appreciate this book for a lot of reasons, but especially for shining a light on this. And hopefully it compels folks to fight against this uncritical race theory nonsense. So, I've talked a lot here. Let me stop and let's get into this. Where do you want us to start? I feel like, this book, there's so much to talk about with this book.
And what a great book it is. It runs through these examples of attacks on anti-racist education, on honest education.
Yes.
And the ways that students and educators are resisting these attacks. So it has these 2 parts to it, which are both great. Yeah. And there are some truly astounding things that have happened to educators and students through the laws that have been passed around the country and the books that have been banned and the ways that white parent associations have gotten together to attack administrators and teachers in school districts across the country.
Yes.
And try to ban books in school districts across the country. And there's some really inspirational organized resistance happening.
Yes.
Through a lot of student activism and through teacher unions and more. And there's room for more of that.
Yes.
But there is a lot of inspirational things out there already happening that he talks about here.
It's true.
But one of the things I wanted to get started with, because there is, as you said, so much in here, is a quote from the introduction about what Jesse calls uncritical race theory, which you referenced just a moment ago.
Yeah.
So he uses this as a term to describe the political perspectives of those who oppose critical race theory.
Right.
Which is probably obvious.
Yeah.
in the term.
But
I wanted to lay it out.
Yeah.
So he describes uncritical race theory as the theory that denies that racism exists at all, or maintains that racism primarily victimizes white people, or rejects any systemic or institutional analysis in favor of an interpersonal explanation that understands racism as only sporadic and merely the product of individual bias. Uncritical race theorists position themselves as natural and objective, unencumbered by ideology or a theory of race, when in fact they have a highly developed theory of race, even if they are unaware of the origins or the full dimensions of this theory.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and I really, really appreciate this analysis because it lines up with what we've been saying a lot here and what a lot of people have been saying, which is that it's crucial to name that denying the existence of systemic racism is also a race theory.
Yes, there it is.
And Jesse really nails it here as uncritical race theory. And it's, I think, a really crucial way to acknowledge that, you know, DeSantis and Trump and all of these people across the country who are really in their feelings about race being named in the classroom or in workplace trainings or in fire departments across the country. They're all in their feelings about this because race isn't being named in the way that they want it to, which is to ignore it.
There it
right?
is. Yes.
Like, and I think that that's, so I just appreciate Jesse for naming it and coming up with his own language for what that looks like throughout this book and how he talks about it throughout the book.
Yeah, I was going to say he uses it throughout the book so brilliantly and laid the foundation for it in the introduction. So I'm really glad you pulled that definition. You analyzed a lot of that so well. One of the things that stood out to me when listening to you read it was this idea of one bad apple when it comes to sort of this idea of, you know, racism isn't this thing that is happening and pervasive and everywhere and we're all doing it. It's individual basis, I think you said. And so, you know, that old rhetoric of one bad apple, thinking about the connection of that to police killings. So there's so much in that definition that we could unpack, but I do really appreciate it. You kind of alluded to this, but the book is broken up in these two parts. The first part of this book is all about the concept and the effect of disremembering as it relates to these attacks on education and kind of education broadly. And another way to put this is, or another way he puts this is organized forgetting. And we've talked about this before and how it's been used as a tool throughout history, really, as a way to try to ensure that people don't push back and don't question what is happening in our society and to people. And one of the ways in which Jesse describes the specific actions of disremembering is as a truth crime. And I really appreciated that terminology and the broad applicability of it to what we're seeing with the breadth and even the depth of these attacks on education. And so I wanted to pull this a little bit. He describes truth crimes as this, quote, "A truth crime is any act of honest pedagogy in a jurisdiction where truthful teaching has been outlawed. Truth crime is enforced disremembering. A truth crime law, then, is one that makes lying to children obligatory and effectively renders honest educators as truth criminals. The goal for the enforcers of truth crime, in the end, is to make committing a truth crime literally impossible because there will be no one left who learned honest history and therefore no one left to teach it. This requires rewriting the past so that it appears to justify the dramatic inequality that exists today and so that it impedes the ability of those who have learned the revisionist history to imagine a future without oppression." So much there, but you know, to me, the most important part of that, the description, that definition, and the big danger of all of this is the idea that there will one day be no one left to teach our history, and I mean that in such a broad way. You know, that these uncritical race theorists are playing the long game to try to ensure that we'll one day get to a place where, you know, I think about this in the context of what's happening with the inauguration and where we're about to go for the next 4 years, where the slogan and more importantly, I think the policies and the fascism behind Make America Great Again are met without resistance. Like, that's the long play here. And it gives me chills to think about the devastating effect that could have on the lives of so many of us. It's really so scary to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Heavy sigh.
I think, Truthcrime is such a great way to describe what's happening across the country to shut down anti-racist and honest education. And I think, he talks about, and you referenced this as an important part of this is there will be no one left to teach history because nobody learned it.
No one learned it.
And people are being pushed out
of
education because they don't want to have to deal with not being able to teach the truth.
Right. Yeah, that idea of lying to children. I mean, that is so...
It's a whole other element of it. And there's examples throughout the book about the ways that people are being asked to lie in the classroom or to avoid discussing anything directly. And it's really, really insane things that people are being asked to avoid. And, some of the people who are doing these truth crimes, Jesse calls educational arsonists.
Yes.
Which he describes as, quote, the fire team shock troops of a social order built on lies. And he introduces this term and this definition in the context of talking about Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi propaganda minister. And a speech that Goebbels gave that used a lot of fire imagery in it in support of his anti-Semitic message.
Right.
And so Jesse then goes on to say, educational arsonists haven't only inflamed Nazi Germany. Uncritical race theorists throughout history have blown a lot of smoke to cloud the truth. And where there's smoke, there's fire. A subset of uncritical race theorists have literally lit fires to burn knowledge. And so he's talking about this in the ways that educational arsonists, quote, use the threat of flame along with actual flammable liquids, matches, torches, dynamite, and bombs in an attempt to cremate bodies of knowledge that support anti-racist and social justice struggles. And he's talking about this and how it's not just about lighting this knowledge on fire. It's also about how to shame and ridicule this kind of learning to make it unacceptable in so-called polite society. So it's about not having people to be able to teach this history anymore. It's about erasing this history from even existing anywhere so you can't access it too. But not having access to it also means getting rid of people at some point. And there's several examples here where they talk about, I don't have this quote pulled up, but he uses quotes throughout the book to illustrate his points. And one of the quotes that he pulls and uses as his point is that people like this start with fires of books and they end with fires of people. And it ends with killing people. And that's an element here that I think is important, that educational arsonists, truth crime, all of this stuff, ultimately it's on a pathway toward something much bigger and much more devastating and openly violent, which is why we have to snuff it out now. We have to oppose it all now.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking about how this will lead us to a really dark place. And one of the other things that stood out to me as you were talking about this concept of educational arsonist, I mean, really, we've thrown out a lot of terms here that are just so brilliant, right? I love the terminology that he's using throughout this book, and it gives name to the things that we're seeing and experiencing, and the actors, good and evil in all of this. So, I mean, speaking of great terminology, there was so much in the second part of the book, which is on remembering, that I also appreciated so much. So much of that section, as you kind of alluded to, was filled with stories of, the whole book is, but this section was filled with stories of educators and students and parents and families fighting against and really resisting uncritical race theorists and their attempts to ban anti-racist education. And it was really moving to read those stories and to see the victories, especially the victories that were led by students. I loved those. And I loved hearing about the lessons that teachers were using in their classroom to educate their students about history. There's some examples there, even examples from Jesse himself. And some of those made me want to be in the classroom again. But one of the biggest takeaways from this part of the book for me was this concept called radical healing of organized remembering. Which I should mention Jesse acknowledges is built off of the concept of radical healing, which was developed by Sean Ginwright. And so Jesse describes it as follows, quote, "The radical healing of organized remembering identifies collective efforts in education but also in social movements to uncover purposely concealed historical lessons that are vital for recovering the historical trauma and building healthy struggles for justice. Trauma is not only inflicted by physical acts of violence, but also by the erasure and distortion of historical truths. When BIPOC youth are denied lessons about their culture and history, it negatively impacts their self-esteem, their understanding of their own agency in the world, and their ability to envision how to help create a more just society. And I love that concept because I think there's a lot of power in connecting students and their learning to historical struggles for justice. And there's a lot of learning that can come from that.
Which is why it's opposed so much.
You know, I will also say that I appreciated little later on in that same chapter, that section, Jesse does some work to address the impact of the radical healing of organized remembering on white students.
Yeah.
You know, because that quote unquote trauma that white students experience in the classroom when they're learning about this stuff has been a huge driver of these attacks on education. You talk about the White Parents Association, and you know we've all seen those videos of town halls and what do you call those, parent-teacher association meetings,
and people being uncomfortable in the classroom.
Uncomfortable. Yeah. And so Jesse addresses this by saying, quote, "It is true that teaching about challenging topics like oppression can create discomfort for both white and BIPOC kids. Yet an uncomfortable truth can be the companion of intellectual growth and healing. Learning the truth about structural racism in America, from slavery to mass incarceration today, can no doubt be disquieting. However, discomfort is different than shame, an emotion that some students may feel at times, but also one that anti-racist educators help guide kids away from and toward the more productive and healing sentiments of solidarity and the determination to create a better society." Yeah. And that's it. That's part of the power of this book to me in these efforts to resist this nonsense that we're seeing. There are ways to, and great educators do this every day. There are ways to educate all of our students about real, true history that is impactful and meaningful and necessary and doesn't shame anyone. And, you know, and especially, and to me, that's so important, especially as we think about how we get towards where we're supposed to be and certainly for our collective liberation, right?
Yeah, I think that the concept of radical healing of organized remembering is really powerful.
Yes.
And this learning in the classroom and organized remembering in the classroom is actually empowering for all kids.
Yes.
Especially you think about if you're learning about a full picture of history, BIPOC students are learning about their resistance to things like enslavement or to the way that Reconstruction collapsed into Jim Crow and all that.
Yes.
In some ways.
Yes.
And that's also true for other cultures.
Absolutely.
Right? Like I think about the ways that I did not learn about anti-racist white people throughout history.
Yep.
And those people who also resisted racism. It was really just like, yeah, Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
And
yes.
and that was kind of it. But think about how impactful it might be to learn about some of the white abolitionists, warts and all, because they weren't perfect.
Absolutely.
But think about the ways that you learn about John Brown or William Lloyd Garrison or the Grimke sisters or these other folks who are influential in the progress of working toward the end of enslavement, and thinking about the ways that it's empowering to see everybody in that picture, the way that it gets to that's different. And the way that we're moving is the prevention of all of that.
Absolutely. Which is shameful, right?
Yeah.
And I think, you know,
I think it creates shame too. It's something that continues to create shame all around.
And I think to your point, learning about that is helpful for all students to see all of these actors, the good, the bad, the ugly, warts and all. I mean, to see the role that white abolitionists played throughout history is certainly impactful for white students, but it's impactful for all of us, all students to learn about that. So I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he talks about the radical healing of organized remembering, and it's connected to this concept that he introduced early on in the book called organized forgetting, which you referenced a little bit, but that was coined by Henry Giroux. And it's described as, quote, an effort by those in power to hide vital lessons of the past that could empower social movements such as the historical legacies of resistance to racism, militarism, privatization, and panoptical surveillance, which have long been forgotten and made invisible in the current assumption that Americans now live in a democratic, post-racial society. It's such a great way to encapsulate and describe what's happening in this holistic sense. It's organized forgetting so that we cannot understand what it is that we've lost within organized abandonment, to use a phrase from Ruth Wilson Gilmore.
Yep.
It's an agenda to force us to ignore the violence inherent in the U.S. through settler colonialism and enslavement and imperialism and mass incarceration and funding the police, all of that stuff. It's a movement away from collective liberation and toward the continuation of the status quo.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I love this book.
Yeah, it's so good.
I love this book. All right, well, let's transition here. Why don't we talk about application? So in this section, we talk about how does this book and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work. And, I think it's pretty obvious how this book applies for us, given that we work in higher education and are educators ourselves and believe in the power of education for good and for the better. And so these attacks on all levels of education and on educators and on learning and on equipping our students with knowledge and critical thinking skills necessary to be, in my opinion, well-developed and successful and engaged citizens and human beings in this world is clearly the takeaway from this book.
Yeah.
And it also reinforces for me just how dangerous these attacks are on our present and certainly on our future. And so this book, to me, is a clarion call for how critically important it is for all of us to do everything we can as individuals, as educators, as parents and families, as schools, school systems, as institutions of higher learning to push back against critical race theorists and this legislation we're seeing and the policies and the bans and the white supremacy of it all when it comes to education. I am someone who believes in the power of education as both a means and an end for people and for our society. And so to me, there's nothing more important than fighting against all of this.
Yeah.
What about you, my friend?
Yeah, my application for this week is from a few of the quotes that Jesse sprinkled throughout this book. They were always well placed and added additional context for his concepts from other thinkers. And so the first one is from the introduction. Actually, both of these are from the introduction.
Okay.
The first one's from James Baldwin. And he said, quote, "People who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction. And anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence long after that innocence is dead turns himself into a monster."
Wow.
Which Jesse used to illustrate his point about uncritical race theorists.
Yeah.
The other quote is from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, quote, "Every burned book or house enlightens the world. Every suppressed or expunged word reverberates through the earth from side to side," which Jesse used to illustrate his point about the destructiveness of educational arsonists and how eventually that arson backfires on the arsonists.
Yes, absolutely. And again, that reminds me of this idea of the slippery slope of where we might be and how just devastating all of this is, right?
Yep.
If we allow it to happen. Absolutely. Those are great quotes. Yeah, I loved the quotes are at sort of the beginning of each chapter from these incredible folks. So,
and then there's some, these two I pulled are actually embedded in the text.
Yes.
And then there are also some that open each chapter.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about homework. How do we want to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave the table today? For me, I would love to share this book with everyone in our professional lives.
Yeah.
I think this book was so important for me and for us to read as educators working in higher education. And I think our colleagues would really benefit from reading this book as well. Not that we aren't aware of what's happening and aren't living it to varying degrees, but I just really appreciated Jesse's analysis of the whole picture of these attacks on education and what I got out of feeling solidarity with the educators and the students and their stories featured in the book, and certainly his call to action in this book. So, I want to do some work to share this book as widely as I can, because I think it's a powerful one.
Yeah.
I'd also like to check out more of Jesse's work. He's an editor of Rethinking Schools magazine and co-editor of Black Lives Matter at School and teaching for Black lives. So I'd love to check out those publications for sure. What about you?
My homework is a book that is mentioned in one of the discussions about Florida. It's by Marvin Dunn, and it's called A History of Florida Through Black Eyes. Oh. And the book is designed to, quote, lift the veil from some of these stories and places African Americans in the very marrow of Florida history. And as a Florida boy, I'm always moved when I learn more about my former home state and what my education is missing and was missing as I came up. And so I really appreciate the work of Marvin Dunn because he's referenced in this book and is quoted in this book. Yeah. And what he's doing in Florida and continuing to teach the history that is buried, like the Rosewood Massacre and some of the other history he teaches through his Teach the Truth tours in Florida. Yeah. So excited to try to learn more and check out this particular book, A History of Florida Through Black Eyes.
I love that, Florida boy. All right. Well, my friend, you're up next time.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode? If you can top this.
No, I cannot.
It's not a competition. Let me stop.
Yeah, you better. So I am bringing an article from Truth Out. It's written by Nicholas Powers and called MLK's Legacy is One of Class Struggle. To fight Trump, we must carry his torch. Oh. We are recording this right before MLK Day and right before the presidential inauguration because that had to happen on the same day this year. Yeah. And so this is timely and feels like an appropriate call to action for us all.
I love it. You might have beat it. No, this sounds great. I'm super excited. And again, so timely. Yep. All of this has been timely. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And Truth Out always brings it. So I'm excited about that. Very good. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.